Four tactical hitmen beating a Mafia kingpin in a dead-end alley in broad daylight. This wasn't a street mugging. They weren't after his money. They were there because a rogue faction ordered an execution. Every strike was methodical. Every blow was meant to shatter. The once untouchable Roman Blackwood sat helpless in the dirt, his dark pinstripe suit torn, eyes wide with shock as he braced for the end. The neighborhood heard it, but nobody stepped in. Nobody dared to look until a slim, black teenage girl wearing white earbuds walked right into the center of the fray. Earlier that same morning, a local street enforcer had blocked her path on her walk to school, laughing right in her face. A quiet, invisible little girl like you. Keep your head down and your earbuds in. You don't matter out here. Nobody stood up for her. Nobody knew about the brutal, daily combat discipline she put her body through just to feel safe in her own skin. But the stone-cold, bare-handed fury she unleashed in that alley changed the entire criminal underworld. This is the story of how the city's most ruthless syndicate learned to fear a teenager named Zuri Washington. Zuri Washington walked down the cracked, uneven pavement of the city's east side, the world around her intentionally reduced to a dull, manageable hum. Her white earbuds were pressed firmly into her ears, a constant, deliberate barrier between her and the chaotic reality of the streets. She wore her high school uniform, a crisp, white short-sleeve collared shirt, a navy blue pleated skirt, and worn black sneakers, blending perfectly into the background of a neighborhood that aggressively demanded invisibility. She was slim, athletic, and entirely unassuming. People looked past her on these blocks. They saw a quiet teenager keeping her head down, just another kid trying to quietly survive the daily gauntlet of gang territories and syndicate violence that plagued the city. They didn't see the tension constantly coiled in her muscles, or the sharp, calculating way her dark eyes tracked every shifting shadow in her periphery. They didn't know that her total silence wasn't born of fear. It was born of incredible discipline. The truth was, Zuri had spent the last 7 years turning her own body into an absolute weapon. Her invisible armor wasn't made of Kevlar or loud intimidation. It was forged in total, agonizing solitude. Flashbacks of her cramped, dimly lit basement apartment often played in her mind as she walked. Hours spent driving her bare fists into a heavy bag wrapped in duct tape until her knuckles bled. Practicing judo sweeps and Krav Maga counters against imaginary opponents until her lungs burned and she collapsed from pure exhaustion. She had meticulously taught herself how to read the subtle shifts in a person's weight, how to anticipate sudden violence before a fist was even raised, and how to entirely redirect overwhelming physical force using nothing but geometry and leverage. She trained in the dark, away from the prying eyes of a neighborhood where showing any kind of physical strength only invited bigger, deadlier predators to test you. She had one singular goal: graduate, get out of this zip code, and completely disappear. She wanted nothing more than to escape the gravitational pull of the criminal underworld that had mercilessly swallowed so many of her peers. Every single block she walked was a potential minefield, controlled by ruthless syndicates and violent street factions who viewed the local residents as nothing more than collateral damage. Zuri knew the ironclad rules of survival better than anyone. You don't make eye contact. You don't speak out of turn. You don't ever show what you are truly capable of, because the moment the wrong people notice you, you immediately become a target. So she kept her white earbuds securely in place, completely ignoring the aggressive posturing of the corner boys. She walked with a steady, unhurried pace, her dark hair catching the autumn wind, fiercely independent and completely self-reliant. She firmly believed that any human connection was a fatal liability. If she fought alone. If she survived alone. It was a lonely, suffocating existence, but it was a safe one. She was a ghost walking blindly through a war zone, completely convinced that as long as she minded her own business, the war would never reach her. Across the city, far from the crumbling, neglected sidewalks of Zuri's daily route, a very different kind of survival was rapidly failing. Roman Blackwood was a man who had never needed to be invisible. In his late 50s, with silver gray hair perfectly styled and sharp, aristocratic facial features, Roman moved through the violent world with the absolute authority of a king. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored pinstripe suit, a deliberate symbol of the vast wealth and ruthless power he wielded as the city's most feared and entrenched mafia boss. He controlled the bustling docks, the political unions, and the massive underground economy with a calculating, icy precision that left no room for error. But immense power always breeds violent ambition, and ambition ultimately breeds betrayal. The fatal strike didn't come from a rival family. It came from deep within his own trusted inner circle, a rogue faction of his syndicate that had secretly decided it was time for the old king to die. It was supposed to be a standard, routine meeting in the desolate warehouse district, a quiet negotiation to settle a minor territory dispute. Instead, it was an elaborate, heavily armed execution trap. Roman's armored convoy was ambushed the moment it arrived, his loyal guards gunned down in a devastating, coordinated crossfire before they could even draw their own weapons. Fleeing the sudden carnage on foot, the aging, outgunned Don found himself separated from his remaining muscle and forced down a narrow, dead-end brick alley. He wasn't running from simple street thugs. He was being systematically hunted by his own elite, highly trained enforcers. 4 heavily built white males in dark tactical clothing easily closed the trap. They were large, ruthless professionals, totally devoid of loyalty, operating solely on the lucrative promise of a hostile syndicate takeover. The ensuing beating was not a frantic, chaotic street brawl. It was a methodical, punishing dismantling of a once powerful man. They didn't simply draw their weapons and end it. The strict order from the rogue faction was to make it hurt, to publicly humiliate him, to physically break the untouchable Roman Blackwood before finishing the job. The lead hitman, a massive operative wearing a black tactical vest and sporting a shaved head, delivered a crushing, breathless blow to Roman's ribs that sent the mafia boss crashing hard to the wet pavement. The others quickly joined in, their heavy boots finding their brutal marks with sickening, practiced precision. Roman's dark, expensive pinstripe suit was quickly torn, dirtied, and covered in the absolute filth of the alley floor. He tasted copper in his mouth. His vision swam and blurred as a heavy kick caught his left shoulder, forcing him backward against the damp brick wall. He was seated helplessly on the ground, leaning back heavily, one hand raised defensively in a totally futile gesture of self-preservation. His chest heaved painfully as he braced for the final, fatal strike. He looked up at the 4 towering, shadowy figures, his aristocratic eyes wide with profound shock and disbelief. The powerful man who had controlled the city's darkest shadows for 3 decades was about to die in one, completely humbled and entirely alone. Zuri's daily shortcut home from school cut straight through that same warehouse district, a quiet route that reliably saved her 20 minutes of walking. The specific alley she usually navigated was a narrow, forgotten stretch of broken pavement hemmed in by towering brick walls, completely devoid of working streetlights or security cameras. It was a place where sound went to die, perfect for someone deeply committed to avoiding attention. As she briskly turned the corner, the rhythmic, sickening sound of heavy boots striking human flesh pierced sharply through the low volume of the music playing in her white earbuds. She stopped dead in her tracks. For a fraction of a second, the intense survival instincts she had honed for years screamed at her to turn around, walk away, and remain invisible. But then she heard it, a ragged, compressed breath escaping a failing chest, a sound of absolute, devastating helplessness that triggered something fiercely protective deep within her isolated core. She abruptly pulled her left earbud out and stepped confidently into the dim, shadowy light of the alley. What she saw was a terrifying scene of calculated, impending execution. 4 massive men in dark tactical gear stood menacingly over an older, bloodied man in a violently torn pinstripe suit. Zuri didn't see a notorious mafia boss. She just saw a helpless victim bracing for death. The 4 elite hitmen didn't immediately notice the slim teenage girl in the navy blue pleated skirt standing behind them. When the closest ones finally turned, they expected her to scream in terror or immediately run for her life. Instead, Zuri's expression went completely, chillingly stone cold. There was no panic in her dark eyes, only pure focus and a deeply controlled fury. She let her heavy school backpack slide off her shoulder, hitting the concrete with a soft thud. Her long, dark hair flew back dramatically as she seamlessly dropped her center of gravity, bending her knees slightly and raising both bare fists into a tight, incredibly grounded fighting stance. She was entirely fearless, compositionally commanding the center of the cramped space like she owned it. The far-right hitman, a hulking figure in dark street clothing, sneering at the sheer, ridiculous audacity of this schoolgirl, lunged forward. He reached out with a massive, heavily calloused hand, fully intending to simply swat her out of the way like a minor nuisance. It was the exact, fatal mistake Zuri had spent 7 grueling years preparing for. She didn't retreat a single inch. Moving with terrifying, explosive speed, she stepped directly inside his reach, pivoting her hips forcefully to slip under his guard. Using his own aggressive forward momentum entirely against him, she delivered a devastating, bone-cracking upward strike directly to his exposed jaw. The sickening impact echoed loudly off the towering brick walls. The huge man violently grimaced, his eyes rolling back in his head as his equilibrium completely shattered, and he stumbled violently backward, instantly eliminated from the fight. The remaining 3 men froze in their tracks. The lead hitman in the black tactical vest recoiled backward in sheer, unadulterated shock, his mouth slightly open, while the stocky man behind him stood entirely paralyzed in absolute disbelief. On the dirty ground, Roman Blackwood slowly lowered his defensive, trembling hand, watching this impossible, gravity-defying intervention unfold right in front of him. The stunned silence in the dark alley lasted only a heartbeat, but in a brutal street fight, a single heartbeat is a sheer eternity. Zuri capitalized immediately on the highly trained hitmen's paralyzing shock with absolute lethal efficiency. She knew implicitly that she couldn't engage all 3 remaining tactical operatives in a prolonged, grinding struggle of endurance. She had to use overwhelming shock and awe, permanently breaking their physical coordination before their vastly superior size and hidden weaponry could be brought to bear. The hitman in the dark hood was the very first to recover his wits, reaching frantically and desperately toward his tactical waistband for a concealed weapon. Before his thick fingers could even brush the cold steel, Zuri closed the critical distance. She launched a blistering, unstoppable combination, a sharp, precise palm strike directly to his vulnerable throat, instantly followed by a sweeping, driving kick behind his knee joint that sent him crashing violently and heavily to the cracked pavement. 2 down in a matter of seconds. The leader in the black tactical vest finally moved, roaring in pure, unadulterated anger as he lunged forward, totally abandoning his disciplined military training in favor of blind, furious brute force. Zuri dropped her stance incredibly low, effortlessly dodging his heavy, wildly swinging arm, and drove her elbow sharply upward into his exposed solar plexus. The air rushed out of the massive man's lungs in a violent, desperate hiss, instantly folding him in half where he stood. She spun smoothly on her heel, using her established momentum to deliver a punishing, perfectly angled hook to the side of his shaved head, dropping him heavily to his knees right beside his groaning, incapacitated accomplices. She was a total phantom in a standard school uniform. ruthlessly dismantling the city's most feared and heavily armed executioners with nothing but her bare hands and a terrifying, utterly silent focus. Suddenly, the sharp, rising, unmistakable wail of police sirens cut sharply through the cold evening air, echoing loudly down the desolate warehouse blocks. The violent trance of the alley was instantly broken. The very last conscious hitman, the stocky man wearing a dark jacket and cap, took a stumbling, terrified step backward. Looking frantically between the rapidly approaching sirens, his completely decimated crew, and the stone-cold teenager who had just single-handedly ruined their million-dollar coup, Zuri didn't wait around to see what his final decision would be. She had done exactly enough to stop the immediate threat. Her breathing remained completely steady as she reached down, grabbed the thick strap of her backpack, and stood up perfectly straight. She didn't look at the massive men groaning in agony on the ground, and she didn't offer a helping hand to the bleeding Mafia kingpin staring up at her in total awe. Like a true ghost, she turned and vanished seamlessly back into the dark shadows of the city street, disappearing as quickly and quietly as she had arrived. Moments later, the aggressive, screeching tires of a black armored SUV signaled the frantic arrival of Roman's surviving, heavily armed loyalists. The men flooded the alleyway, tightly securing the perimeter and rushing forward to pull their battered, bleeding Don to his feet. Roman Blackwood winced sharply as they hastily dusted off his ruined pinstripe suit, but his sharp, aristocratic eyes weren't focused on his bleeding hands or the moaning bodies of his defeated enemies. He simply stared transfixed at the empty, shadowy space at the end of the alley where the fearless girl had just vanished. The ruthless man who entirely controlled the city's vast underworld had just been saved by a total phantom. As his panicked men quickly ushered him into the safety of the armored vehicle, Roman made a silent, unbreakable vow. The teenage girl in the white sneakers had utterly humiliated his assassins, and he was absolutely, completely fixated on finding her. The botched execution in the alleyway was more than just a humiliating defeat for the rogue syndicate faction. It was an absolute, catastrophic liability. The 4 highly trained tactical hitmen had been paid an exorbitant sum to eliminate the city's most powerful man, and instead they had been systematically dismantled by a teenager in a school uniform. The leader of the hit squad, a massive enforcer with a shaved head and a severely bruised jaw, knew that if Roman Blackwood survived long enough to reach his loyalists, the entire coup would collapse. They needed to finish the job, but more urgently, they needed to erase the ghost who had ruined their perfect ambush. They tore through the neighborhood's sparse digital footprint, eventually recovering a few grainy frames of security footage from a corner bodega. The camera angle was terrible, but it was enough to capture a flash of a navy blue pleated skirt, a crisp white collared shirt, and the stark white wires of earbuds dangling as the girl hurried away from the scene. It wasn't a name, but it was a uniform. The hitmen immediately mobilized, deploying their vast, illegal street network to scour every high school district on the east side. They were desperate, dangerous, and completely committed to hunting her down, turning the city blocks into a massive, invisible grid of surveillance. Meanwhile, deep within the reinforced walls of an underground syndicate safe house, Roman Blackwood was refusing medical rest. His chest was heavily bandaged, and his dark pinstripe suit had been replaced by a clean, charcoal dress shirt, but the sharp, aristocratic lines of his face were hardened with cold fury. He sat at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by his most trusted lieutenants, who had rushed to secure him. They expected him to immediately plan a violent retaliation against the rogue faction, but Roman's absolute priority was completely different. He understood the ruthless mathematics of the underworld better than anyone. The men who had tried to execute him would not simply walk away. They would stop at nothing to eliminate the only surviving witness to their treason. He slammed his fist onto the table, his silver-gray hair catching the low light as he issued a singular, non-negotiable command. They were to activate every shadow network, every informant, and every loyal enforcer on the payroll to find the teenage girl before the hitmen did. It was no longer just about taking back his criminal empire. It was a desperate race against the clock. Roman owed his life to a child who had stood her ground when highly trained killers would have run. He knew the terrifying efficiency of the men hunting her, and he knew that her anonymity, her only real shield, was rapidly disintegrating. The streets were quietly boiling over, caught in a silent, deadly tug-of-war between a desperate hit squad trying to bury a mistake and a furious mafia kingpin determined to protect his unexpected savior. The suffocating reality of being hunted hit Zuri the very next afternoon as she walked out of the heavy double doors of her high school. She had her white earbuds pressed firmly into her ears, perfectly mimicking her usual routine, but the cord wasn't plugged into anything. Her music was off. Her senses were dialed up to a razor-sharp frequency, meticulously scanning the crowded sidewalk. That was when she saw him. Leaning casually against a rusted street lamp across the avenue was the stocky man in the dark jacket and cap from the alleyway. He wasn't looking at the crowd. His cold, dead eyes were locked directly on her. Her carefully constructed invisible armor shattered in an instant. The ghosts of the criminal underworld had found her, and they had brought the war directly to her front steps. Zuri didn't panic. She didn't break into a dead sprint that would immediately draw attention and trigger a chase. Instead, she seamlessly merged into a thick group of departing students, using their chaotic movement as a physical shield while she rapidly calculated her escape route. She knew the intricate geometry of her neighborhood better than any syndicate mercenary. She slipped through a narrow gap in a chain-link fence, weaving through narrow back alleys and cutting across abandoned residential lots with the practiced, silent agility of a shadow. But the hitmen were seasoned professionals. They didn't just chase, they methodically herded her. Every time Zuri tried to circle back toward the crowded, safer main avenues, a heavy-set figure in dark, tactical clothing materialized to cut off her path. They were intentionally driving her away from the public eye, pushing her toward the industrial dead zone at the edge of the district. Her lungs burned as she finally vaulted over a concrete barrier, landing heavily in the gravel of an abandoned, sprawling train yard. Rusting boxcars towered around her like iron canyons. She spun around, realizing instantly that she had run out of exits. From the deep shadows of the decaying trains, all four heavily built men stepped into the fading afternoon light. The leader, with the shaved head, cracked his knuckles, a sickening smile spreading across his face as they drew their weapons and closed the tight circle. Zuri slowly dropped her heavy backpack into the dirt. She took a slow, deep, measured breath, her long, dark hair shifting dynamically in the autumn wind, and dropped her center of gravity into a deeply grounded, fearless fighting stance. She was entirely prepared to engage in a brutal, 4-on-1 fight to the absolute death. But just as the first massive enforcer lunged forward to strike, the deafening, explosive roar of a high-performance engine shattered the tense silence. A sleek, heavily armored black SUV violently smashed through the chained perimeter gates, sending twisted iron flying into the air. The massive vehicle skidded to a violent, dust-kicking halt in the gravel right between Zuri and her startled attackers, the heavy passenger door throwing open to reveal the sharp, commanding presence of Roman Blackwood. He had finally found her. Inside the reinforced interior of the armored convoy, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Zuri sat rigidly against the luxurious leather upholstery, her hands folded tightly in her lap, completely out of place in her blue pleated skirt and school uniform. Across from her sat Roman Blackwood. The visual contrast between them was striking and undeniable. He was the embodiment of entrenched wealth and absolute authority, his silver gray hair perfectly in place, carrying the dark, heavy aura of a man who controlled thousands of lives. She was just a quiet, athletic high schooler, whose knuckles were still bruised from fighting his battles. Roman broke the silence first, his voice carrying a smooth, practiced diplomacy. He formally offered her total sanctuary, unlimited financial resources, and the permanent protection of his most elite guards. He promised to move her far away from the violence of the city. But Zuri simply stared back at him with a stone-cold expression, her fatal flaw rising violently to the surface. She had survived her entire life by refusing to rely on anyone. Trust in her harsh world was nothing more than a fatal weakness waiting to be exploited. She flatly refused his money and his sanctuary, declaring with quiet, fierce independence that she adamantly refused to become a helpless pawn in a mafia war she didn't start. She demanded he stop the car and let her walk away, entirely convinced she could handle the hitmen on her own terms. Roman listened carefully to her defiant rejection, genuinely humbled by the sheer magnitude of her unwavering courage. He quickly realized that treating her like a terrified civilian or a hired mercenary was a profound mistake. He leaned forward, completely dropping his authoritative, aristocratic facade, and spoke to her not as a commanding mafia kingpin, but as a man who implicitly understood the brutal reality of their shared enemy. He explained, with chilling clarity, that the rogue faction hunting them possessed absolutely no honor and recognized no boundaries. If Zuri simply walked away and disappeared back into her neighborhood, the hitmen wouldn't just give up the chase. They would relentlessly burn down her apartment building, target her classmates, and systematically destroy everyone she had ever walked past until they drew her out into the open. Her deep isolation, the very invisible armor she had meticulously used to protect herself for years, was now the exact weapon her enemies would use against her. Roman looked directly into her dark, calculating eyes and laid out the stark, unavoidable truth. She could no longer fight this war entirely alone, without causing massive, devastating collateral damage to innocent people. Unless they combined their distinct strengths, her unparalleled close-quarters combat mastery, and his vast, strategic tactical resources, the streets she called home would drown in the crossfire. For the very first time in her life, Zuri felt the immense, terrifying weight of realizing that true survival required genuine connection, and she slowly gave a single, reluctant nod of agreement. The abandoned industrial shipping yard sat completely silent under the heavy, overcast night sky, illuminated only by a single, flickering overhead halogen bulb. It was the perfect stage for an ambush, exactly the kind of isolated environment the rogue syndicate hitmen had been desperately searching for. Zuri Washington purposefully stepped out from the deep shadows and into the stark pool of yellow light. She wasn't running anymore. She stood perfectly still, her white earbuds hanging visibly from her collar, acting as the ultimate, undeniable bait. It took less than 10 minutes for the trap to spring. The perimeter doors groaned open, and the 4 massive tactical enforcers fanned out into the yard. They moved with aggressive, predatory confidence, drawing their heavy weapons and sneering at the slim teenage girl who had seemingly cornered herself. The leader with the shaved head barked a harsh command, fully intending to finally execute the contract that had humiliated them days prior. But the moment all 4 men crossed the threshold into the center of the yard, the heavy steel shipping doors behind them slammed violently shut with a deafening crash. Roman Blackwood's heavily armed loyalists materialized from the upper catwalks, their laser sights instantly painting the floor and entirely cutting off every possible exit. The hitmen froze, realizing too late that they hadn't cornered a terrified high schooler. They had confidently walked directly into a meticulously engineered kill box. High on the catwalk, Roman stood in his pristine suit, looking down at the trapped mercenaries with cold, aristocratic disdain. But he didn't give the order to fire. He had made a very specific promise to the girl standing below him. Zuri didn't want the men executed from a distance. She wanted to permanently break the lingering fear they had tried to instill in her neighborhood. She reached up, slowly pulled her long dark hair back into a tight tie, and dropped into her deeply grounded fighting stance. The psychological shift in the yard was immediate. Deprived of their absolute tactical advantage and boxed in by superior firepower, the four hitmen panicked. The massive leader lunged forward in a desperate, wild frenzy, hoping to use Zuri as a human shield. This time, there was no element of surprise, no dark alley to hide in. There was only Zuri's flawless, fearless mastery of leverage and momentum. As the huge man swung his heavy fist, Zuri slipped beneath his guard with blinding speed. She drove her palm sharply upward into his elbow joint with a sickening crack, disarming him instantly before sweeping his legs out from under him with bone-shaking force. The hooded man rushed her blindside, but she pivoted seamlessly, using the first man's falling weight as a fulcrum to launch a devastating spinning kick directly into his chest. She moved like a perfectly calibrated machine, neutralizing the remaining two enforcers with pure focus and controlled fury. Within 60 seconds, all four elite hitmen were groaning helplessly on the concrete floor, utterly dismantled by a teenager who hadn't fired a single shot, while the city's most feared mob boss watched in absolute, silent awe. With the syndicate's deadliest hit squad utterly defeated and groaning on the concrete floor, the psychological back of the rogue faction was permanently broken. The surviving traitors within the organization surrendered by sunrise. Completely terrified by the rapidly spreading rumors of a phantom schoolgirl who could dismantle heavily armed men with her bare hands, Roman Blackwood reclaimed his rightful throne at the pinnacle of the city's vast criminal underworld with absolute, uncontested authority. He systematically purged the disloyal elements of his empire, ensuring that the violent coup was nothing more than a dark, bloody footnote in his long reign. But the wealthy Mafia kingpin fully understood that his entire restored empire, his wealth, and his very life were entirely owed to the quiet teenager who had stepped out of the shadows. To pay his massive, incalculable debt, Roman enacted an unprecedented, strict mandate that echoed through every dark corner, back alley, and underground boardroom in the city. The entire East Side zip code, specifically Zuri, Washington, and the neighborhood she called home, was declared an absolute, permanent sanctuary. It was completely off-limits to any syndicate activity, gang violence, or intimidation tactics. Any criminal operative who dared to cross that newly drawn line would not have to deal with the police. They would answer directly to the full, devastating wrath of Roman Blackwood himself. The streets surrounding Zuri's high school became the safest blocks in the entire metropolitan area overnight, shielded by an invisible, ironclad wall of Mafia protection. A few days later, the crisp autumn wind swept through the residential avenues as Zuri navigated her usual route to school. The cracked pavement was the same, and the fading brick buildings hadn't changed. But the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of ambient violence had completely vanished from the air. She wore her standard navy blue pleated skirt, her white, short-sleeve collared shirt, and her worn black sneakers. The familiar white earbuds were securely placed in her ears, lightly pumping the rhythmic bass line of a song into her head. She was no longer walking in absolute silence, hyper-alert to the subtle shifts in dangerous shadows. She walked past the corner store, where the street enforcers used to stand, but today, they respectfully lowered their eyes and gave her a wide, deferential berth as she passed. She didn't need to blend into the background anymore. She didn't need to forge her body into a weapon just to survive the simple act of walking out her front door. The profound realization settled comfortably into her chest as she approached the heavy double doors of her high school. True strength hadn't come from entirely isolating herself. It had come from stepping into the fray when it mattered most, and trusting that she didn't have to carry the weight of the world completely alone. Zuri Washington still wore her invisible armor, but she no longer used it to hide from the city. She walked forward with the quiet, untouchable confidence of someone who knows exactly what she is capable of. No longer just a ghost, but undeniably, completely fearless.